Now that we've covered how to create space in a two-dimensional image, we should learn how to organize that space. The degree of implied movement in your composition can affect how the viewer interacts with it greatly. Static forms appear stable and unmoving, while dynamic forms imply movement. What is a dynamic composition? Dynamic compositions are balanced asymmetry that can create a more dynamic composition. Dynamic compositions create a feeling of movement. They introduce visual tension to an image, and they keep the eye moving throughout the picture plane. What is a static composition? A static composition is the opposite of dynamic. With static compositions, you create a sense of stillness and orderliness. Symmetry emphasizes static compositions. But that's the point of symmetry. It's just there. One downside to static compositions is they can feel too bland or uninteresting if done incorrectly. Neither is the correct answer for composition, but rather are options when deciding how to compose your painting. Notice that in these two paintings, one is more static and the other is more dynamic. By shifting the grouping of objects away from a centralized point, the eye is forced to move around the composition. Implied line. In art, implied lines aren't drawn, but they are created with hue, values, shapes, textures, and spaces between objects. Their purpose is to guide the viewer's eye within the artwork and emphasize certain elements. Implied line, whenever used, might not be complete and unbroken, and it may consist of small parts and dashes or not be visible at all. The human brain still completes it in the mind's eye and interprets that the line exists. So you may just start it and the viewer's mind will complete it for you. These compositional arrangements use implied line to lead the viewer's eye throughout the picture plane. The implied lines in this painting are created with the repeating shapes of the ice creams and with the tabletop to create a nice balanced harmony. Illustrations of eye movement and implied line can be seen in these illustrations by Thomas Kegler. There's no magic trick or simple fix to producing a satisfying composition. These are simply armatures which you can use as a first step. Think about ways you organize your page. What's your focal point? How do you want the viewer's eye to move? How can you use implied line to achieve this? These are all questions you should ask yourself before you even start to paint. One of the most important rules in art is the rule of thirds. Dividing your composition into thirds can give you an idea of how to arrange your still life. However, when designing your composition, putting your focal point in a center box marked with an O will make it feel static. To create a more dynamic composition, position objects and focal points along the intersections of those lines instead. These two paintings are similar in detail and subject matter. However, one works much better than the other. Each has the skull in the center, but one is more dynamic. Why is this? By using the rule of thirds and having the skull slightly off-center in the middle section creates a more dynamic layout. The skull directly confronting the viewer in the first image keeps the eye from exploring the rest of the composition. The skull in the second image, placed at a slight angle, invites the viewer into the background. The rule of thirds is helpful when choosing a schematic armature. Notice how the pyramidal scheme hits several points on the grid. The pyramid, when hitting the edges of the objects of note, lead the eye around the image. The skull may be in the center, but it's only one part of the path the eye takes. By extending one of the arms of the triangle to become a geometric pyramid, the line still crosses the grid and hits a focal point. We'll continue by looking at compositional arrangements covered earlier. Pyramidal compositions are a popular device amongst Renaissance artists. They were used to draw the viewer's attention to a figure to give an impression of stability. To construct a pyramidal composition, an artist places objects and figures within an outline of an imaginary triangle or pyramid on the picture plane. Circle or O compositions should be roughly indicated and not obvious. As such, it can be a rough circle, also taking the appearance of a rectangle or irregular opening. Notice how the shadow on the two balls, along with the clown's frill, create a rounded composition. Rounded compositions are good for having a static image while still having the viewer's eye move throughout the picture plane. U-shaped compositions are very similar to circle compositions, however, they are a lot more dynamic. Consider them as circle composition but with an open end. Also similar to the circular composition are the cross and the radiating line. The cross is not as useful for outdoor compositions, as the cross is better used in works with architecture, boats, or leafless trees. The point of interest should be placed near the crossing of main lines. The radiating line composition draws the attention to the point of interest, which should be placed at or near the converging line. Be aware that if the lines are not unbroken, it forces the eye to travel too fast, as in obvious spoke-like design. To solve this issue, make sure all the lines are broken, irregular, or intercepted. Notice how this composition by Monet has the points of interest as the flower heads. However, the point of interest is broken up by the green mass of the leaves. Steelyard is the most popular form of compositional balance used. A scale with two unequal sized masses, the fulcrum placed towards the larger one. The focal point should be on or near the fulcrum or main weight. There is usually a vertical visual connection between the main and lesser weights. When placing the weights, consider all three dimensions. One can be further back in perspective. Utilize the foreground, middle ground, and background when placing the masses. L-shaped compositional arrangements are good for slightly off-balance pictures. The weight from the objects in the foreground is balanced by the dark hue of the background on the right. L-shaped compositions are similar to and compatible with the Steelyard. It's not very common as it's tough to balance a large vertical mass with one horizontal line. Once creating a considerable slant in the main line, either from top left to bottom right or reversed, the next important factor is to oppose or intercept these other lines or masses. By doing so, this composition shares elements from other armatures. The L-shaped composition here can be turned into a cornerstone for a triangular composition. The S or compound curve composition typically suggested by a line or edge rather than mass. For example, think of a river or a road. It can also be seen when general curve suggestion is formed in both positive and negative spaces, anywhere in the composition. If a point of interest exists, it should be placed in or near the converging end of the main lines. Notice how the artist used the natural shapes of vegetables to help form the S curve here. Here are some other aspects to consider when laying out your composition. Think of group masses. Unity is achieved here by placing several masses into a group. This is the most widely used in painting still lifes. It's easily and best combined with patterns and silhouette compositions. Think about rhythms and repeating elements when composing your still life. In this image, the vertical lines of the bottles and jar play with the repeating circles of the apples. This repetition creates a pattern. It is, at the same time, using a pyramidal and circular compositional arrangement to create a more unified image. Furthermore, placing objects in front of others creates depth in your image. Thinking about what we've covered here, how many compositional arrangements can you find in this painting? Now that we've learned to organize our two-dimensional space, we will begin painting. Before you begin painting, decide on a surface. A wood grain table can look great, but only if you're confident with handling the detail, as taking shortcuts on textures can really weaken a drawing or painting. A beginner might be better using a tablecloth. Choose a plain one if you don't want any extra detail, or a broad check or stripe pattern to add a little color without getting overboard. Adjust the lighting if you need to. If the room lighting is diffused, use a board or shadow box to control the lighting effect on your subject. You can also introduce artificial lighting. If you're using natural light, take photos frequently to refer to once the light starts to change. Also take photographs if using perishables, especially flowers, or if you're set up where your work may be disturbed. A good directional light source is the key to a strong drawing or painting, and a lamp or bright window is perfect. Think about your background. Architectural features such as a window frame or door can add direction to a composition. A tone that contrasts with the subject is useful. Just remember that these features will also be part of the composition, so choose wisely. For this arrangement, I have placed a canvas sheet behind the objects. This allows me to focus on the objects themselves without a background. However, this method can make the objects appear to float, so be judicious and focus on drop shadows. Always create a background. Your painting will appear off with no context to your objects. So to play it safe, I will paint the background shadows. This will lend context to the scene and allow the backdrop to exist as an object. Another tool to help you is a viewfinder. Viewfinders help you find your rule of thirds. You can make these quite easily. It can be as simple as using an empty frame cut out of a sturdy cardboard. Use string to mark your thirds off on the hole you made. This will block out all distraction and allow you to access the composition and consider its placement. If using a phone or camera, you can enable Viewfinder Grid in your settings. Choosing your objects. Remember that a still life can be any object or group of objects, so don't get trapped into traditional subject matter. To create the best still life drawings, you'll also need to think about lighting in the background as much as the subject. Think about your lighting and your background as part of the composition, as they will be in the painting as well. Your painting isn't just about the subjects, it's about the surrounding and context. Look at what kind of shadows are made by the lighting. Are they interesting? Are they engaging? As beginners, you should avoid oddly shaped or complex objects. After I collected all the objects that interested me aesthetically, I weeded them down to just a few. I noted the varied values of each to achieve a more interesting composition. Try not to choose things that are all one value. Once you have your objects, arrange them. When arranging, consider compositional elements and avoid bland central positioning and too much symmetry. Think about the compositional schematics and armatures. Change your viewpoint. If using a camera, take as many photos as you can from different angles. How does the position of objects affect the composition? What does a higher vantage point do to the objects? How does it affect the arrangements that have a lower viewpoint? Play with lighting. What kind of shadows emerge? How strong do you want the lighting? I took several photos from several angles, often rearranging objects as I went. You will want as many options as possible before you begin. Just remember, the composition is just as important as the finished painting. A thumbnail drawing is a quick sketch that explores the structure and value of a composition. To create a thumbnail of your setup, look at it through a viewfinder. Note how the objects relate to one another and how the setup might be cropped. On a sheet of white paper, draw the contours or outlines of the objects inside a 4" by 5" rectangle. Then render the sketch in just 3 values: light, medium, and dark. Light being the white of your page. Try several drawings from multiple angles. This will help you understand your monochromatic value set. While you work, be sure to have at least 5 value shifts. You can print and cut out a value scale to help you as you set up and paint. Start by establishing what your darkest value is, followed by finding your lightest. Remember that absolute black and absolute white may not be in your composition. Check your painting against the value scale frequently. Remember, certain values may be perceived as lighter or darker based on their context. Again, look at your subject frequently. If you are painting from memory, you aren't painting accurately. Observation will help you take the guesswork out of painting. This concludes Model 3.2. In this module, we have covered value ranges, shadow structure, rendering believable 3-dimensional space on a 2-dimensional surface, and compositional organization. The unvoiced PowerPoints and vocabulary will be available on Canvas for review if needed. Please refer to the assignment sheet for instructions on this model's assignment parameters.